The bitter, briny wind whipping off the Sea of Galilee did not feel like the breath of life. It felt like the rasp of a shroud. My name is Silas, and just 3 weeks ago, I commanded an empire built on oil and timber, a small fleet of quick ships that made the journey between Phoenicia and the bustling ports of the Decapolis in record time. I was respected, perhaps feared, definitely envied. My house in Capernaum was built of the finest basalt, overlooking the docks where my money was born. Now, standing on the edge of that very dock, the only thing I commanded was the nauseating urge to vomit. The sea did not just swallow my ships. It swallowed my identity, my future, and every last shred of my self-respect. It was not a single great storm that ruined me, but a series of calculated risks built on arrogance, cemented by bad intelligence, and finally extinguished by a freak late-season squall that took 3 of my vessels south of Hippos, scattering their precious cargo of cedar planks and rare unguents across the waves like spilled crumbs. The ledger, which I still carried rolled tightly in my tunic like a painful memory, confirmed the disaster with unforgiving numbers. My debts were not merely large. They were astronomical, owed primarily to men whose patience was measured in Roman brass and whose interest was paid in human flesh. There was Caius, the Roman customs official whose quiet cruelty was legendary, demanding immediate repayment for the delayed tariffs on the phantom cargo. There was also Eleazar ben Zadok, a wealthy, influential member of the Jerusalem Council who had backed my expansion into the grain trade, a venture that proved utterly worthless. Eleazar did not want money. He wanted deference, humiliation, and, worst of all, my beautiful home as collateral. The weight of that debt pressed down on me, not just financially, but physically, transforming my normally robust frame into something gaunt and hollow. I hadn't slept soundly since the news arrived, every shadow becoming a creditor, every knock on the door a bailiff. I had lost the confidence to even look people in the eye. I, Silas, the king of the shores, was now a fugitive ghost haunting the edges of my former kingdom. The failure was so complete, so utterly consuming, that it wasn't just a business transaction. It was a character assassination. People whispered, they pointed. The men who once bowed now averted their gazes, afraid the stench of my misfortune was contagious. My wife, Miriam, bless her steady heart, had tried to argue for patience, for a smaller life, but I couldn't hear her over the roar of my wounded pride. I had promised her a palace, security, and a name that would be revered for generations. I had delivered ruin. I clutched the ledger tighter, the sharp edges of the papyrus cutting into my palm. It was the only thing I had left that proved I was once worth something, and now it only served as the detailed catalog of my absolute undoing. The sun began to set over the hills, painting the sky in colors of false hope, colors I no longer deserved to see. I knew, with chilling certainty, that I could not stay in Capernaum another night. The walls were closing in, and the consequences of my failure were preparing to execute their final judgment. The first stage of my flight was an exercise in pure paranoia. I couldn't take the main roads leading out of Capernaum. Too many eyes, too many opportunities for Caius's men to spot the formerly recognizable figure of Silas, now draped in ragged, inconspicuous cloth. I had traded my expensive Galilean mantle for a coarse wool cloak and had shaved my beard roughly to alter my appearance. But the shame was stamped on my brow clearer than any tattoo. I walked east along the lesser-known paths, the dusty goat tracks that wound through the low hills toward Bethsaida, keeping the familiar, comforting curve of the sea always in sight, yet always just out of reach. The irony of seeking refuge on foot, just a few hundred feet from the very water that had been my vehicle to wealth, was a cruel, relentless joke. Every time I passed a traveling merchant, even a poor fisherman dragging his nets, my heart hammered against my ribs, convinced they were agents sent to drag me back to face the music of my debts. The scale of the loss wasn't just the ships. It was the entire infrastructure of my life. My servants were dismissed, my smaller properties seized. Even my beloved scribe, old Tobias, had offered a tearful apology, unable to follow me into this exile, afraid of the creditor's reach. This loneliness was a heavy, suffocating blanket. I realized that my success had not bred loyalty, but dependence. Now that the fountain of money had dried up, The dependence vanished like dew in the morning sun. I spent 3 days moving slowly, subsisting on stale bread and stolen figs. The kind of meager existence I used to pity in the beggars I sometimes tossed a single denarius toward, more for show than charity. Now I was worse off than them, for they had nothing to lose, and I carried the memory of everything I had possessed. Near the border of the Upper Galilee, I dared to spend a night in a small, isolated inn. The innkeeper, a grizzled old man who squinted suspiciously at everyone, asked few questions. But when he demanded prepayment in silver for the meager room, I hesitated, reaching into the small pouch I carried. The weight of the silver was terrifyingly light. This was all I had left, enough to buy maybe 5 more days of subsistence, certainly not enough to start over, and nowhere near enough to buy my freedom. Lying on the scratchy straw mattress, watching the sliver of moon through the cracked window, I began to calculate. If I moved south quickly, towards Samaria, I might disappear entirely, losing myself in the mix of foreign travelers and disconnected villages. But Samaria was hostile territory, geographically and spiritually. The other option was the harsh, Roman-controlled regions east of the Jordan, the Decapolis. That was where my ships had sunk, a land of open spaces, Greek cities, and severe laws. Either way, the road ahead was paved with suffering. I felt a surge of pure, acidic resentment towards the God of Abraham. Why me? Had I not offered the prescribed sacrifices? Had I not kept the feasts? I had been ambitious, yes, but others were more rapacious, more dishonest. Yet they flourished, and I, Silas, lay here, ruined, tasting the dust of failure in every breath. The injustice of it all fueled my decision. I would head for the Decapolis. It was the last place anyone would look for the great merchant who had lost his fortune there. It was the site of the crime, and perhaps the location of my final hiding place. The journey through the rocky trails leading into the territory of the Decapolis, skirting the southern edges of the sea, was grueling. The heat became oppressive, a tangible force that sapped the strength right out of my bones. I was unused to this kind of travel. My previous journeys had been conducted from the cushioned cabin of a swift vessel or atop a well-fed mule. Now my feet were blistered and bloody, and my cloak felt like a lead blanket. The landscape itself seemed to mirror the emptiness in my soul: scrubland, jagged rocks, and unforgiving slopes. This was not the fertile Galilee I knew. This was a land of harsh, untamed beauty, indifferent to human suffering. I hadn't seen another traveler for hours, and the silence was unnerving, broken only by the rasp of my own breathing. I realized with a sickening lurch how close I was to true, physical expiration. I was not starving yet, but I was dehydrated, dizzy, and the small amount of silver I had left meant that water and clean food were luxury items I could ill afford. My mind, usually a sharp, relentless instrument of commerce and calculation, began to turn inward, churning up memories of my past life like flotsam. I remembered the exhilarating thrill of signing my first major contract, the smell of expensive saffron and cinnamon that used to cling to my clothes, the pride in Miriam's eyes when I presented her with a necklace of Mediterranean pearls. These memories were no comfort. They were instruments of torture, highlighting the height from which I had fallen. The deeper I walked into the wilderness, the more clearly I saw the man I had truly become. Not a resourceful visionary, but a greedy fool who had chased fleeting profits at the expense of his soul. I had stopped praying years ago, not because I disbelieved, but because my God had become the ledger itself. I worshipped the growing numbers, the expansion of the fleet, the increasing social distance between myself and the common people. Now, I was the common, failing person, praying only for the strength to take the next step. I stumbled upon a small cave tucked into the side of a canyon. It was shallow, offering little protection, but it was better than the exposure of the open road. I collapsed onto the cool, dusty floor, pulling my cloak over my head, trying to shut out the relentless sun and the gnawing hunger. My failure wasn't just financial, it was existential. I had nothing to offer the world now. No skills relevant to this new, brutal existence. I was only good at commanding, directing, and accumulating. Strip away the wealth, and Silas was nobody, a cipher. The shame of returning to Miriam was unbearable, but the shame of dying alone, forgotten in this desolate place, was equally terrifying. I reached for the one comforting object left to me, the tightly rolled ledger. I traced the faded ink, the entries detailing the last, fatal shipment. The weight of that failure was the only thing anchoring me to reality. As night fell, bringing a deceptive chill to the desert air, I heard the faint, distant sound of voices and bells. A caravan, perhaps, or a shepherd moving his flock. Fear mingled with a desperate flicker of hope. I desperately wanted human interaction, but the fear of recognition was stronger. I hugged the shadows of the cave, choosing isolation over the risk of capture, condemning myself further to this self-imposed prison of regret. Days blurred into a single, aching span of hunger and vigilance. I managed to reach a small, dusty village perched precariously on a hill overlooking the Yarmouk River Gorge. It was an insignificant place, far enough from the main Roman thoroughfares to feel safe, yet large enough to offer meager sustenance. I took to performing small, menial tasks, hauling water, splitting wood for a reluctant baker, earning a few paltry coins and enough leftover food to survive. My hands, once soft and manicured, were now calloused and cracked, a physical testament to my reversal of fortune. In this village, though, something else began to pierce the fog of my despair. The fragmented, baffling whispers of a radical teacher from Galilee. The common people here, simple shepherds and farmers, spoke of him with a strange blend of awe and familiarity, calling him the rabbi, or the carpenter's son. They spoke of miracles, of wine created from water, of fevers instantly cooled, and, most disturbingly to my cynical mind, of demons being cast out merely by a word. The stories reached me in disjointed snippets over fires and in the noisy marketplace. They were fantastic, bordering on the ridiculous, yet the earnest conviction in the eyes of the storytellers was undeniable. One woman, her face wrinkled like dried parchment, described how this teacher had healed a leper, embracing the man where others would recoil. Another spoke of him feeding 5,000 people with only a few loaves of bread and 2 fish, making the impossible seem commonplace. I listened, always from the periphery, scoffing internally. My entire life had been governed by hard facts, by ledgers, by supply and demand. This was fantasy, cheap theatrics designed to pacify the masses who were too poor or too weak to achieve real success. Forgiveness, grace, these were concepts foreign to the world I had inhabited, where every transaction demanded repayment, where every favor carried interest. I scoffed the loudest at the stories of forgiveness of sins, especially when associated with debts. They said he told people, "Your sins are forgiven," often to the physically sick. What did spiritual forgiveness have to do with the crippling reality of a lost fleet and crushing debts owed to Caius and Eleazar? Such spiritual platitudes were meaningless when faced with the cold steel of a debt collector's warrant. Yet, the persistent mention of him began to grate on my nerves. It was the sheer joy in the voices of those who spoke of him, a joy I hadn't felt since I was a child. It was a warmth that stood in sharp contrast to the cold, dead sensation in my own chest. One evening, huddled near a communal fire, I heard a man argue passionately that this Jesus had the power to make a failed life new again, not by restoring wealth, but by restoring the purpose that wealth had obscured. This was the moment that the concept truly stung. My purpose had been accumulating. My value had been measured by what I owned. If he promised a purpose outside of that framework, what was it? And did I even have the courage to find out? No, I decided, crushing the flicker of curiosity. This rabbi was for the simple folk, for those who had never known the pinnacle of power and the depths of despair that came with it. I was a practical man, and my problem required silver and ships, not parables and prayers. I retreated to my lonely corner, convinced that the only solution to my predicament lay in hard, cynical survival, or perhaps ultimate self-erasure. I hit rock bottom, not in a dramatic confrontation with my past, but in the quiet, suffocating solitude of the wilderness. My body finally betrayed me. After days of starvation and dehydration, wandering aimlessly south of Gadara, I collapsed beside a dry stream bed, the sun beating mercilessly down. I couldn't move. The world had narrowed to the burning grit beneath my cheek and the agonizing thirst in my throat. I had abandoned the village, fearing that my continued presence was drawing unwanted attention, and now I was paying the price for that fear. My few remaining coins were spent. The ledger, damp with my sweat, was still clutched in my useless hand. This was the end. No grand gesture, no tragic hero's death, just an ignominious fade into the dust, judged a failed man by God and by my peers. Lying there, gazing up at the indifferent blue sky, I didn't feel rage anymore. Rage requires strength. I felt only a vast, chilling emptiness, a spiritual vacuum. I remembered the pride I used to take in my self-sufficiency, in having pulled myself up from poverty through sheer will. But now that will was broken. I realized with stunning clarity that I had been building my house on sand, and when the flood came, the flood of debt and loss, it was swept away. This wasn't just punishment for my greed. It was the inevitable consequence of trusting fleeting things. My father, a humble fisherman, had once told me, "Silas, wealth is useful, but the only true wealth is the peace within the soul." I had laughed at the sentimentality then, convinced he was simply masking his lack of ambition. Now I understood. I had chased the shadow and lost the substance. I had spent years meticulously tracking every bushel of grain, every jar of oil, yet I had never once bothered to take inventory of my own soul. Was there anything left of the good man I perhaps once was? Or had the relentless pursuit of profit filed down every noble edge until only sharp, grasping cynicism remained? It was in that moment of absolute surrender, stripped of all strength, resources, and self-delusion, that a single question echoed in the cavern of my mind, a question that cut deeper than any creditor's demand. What good is saving your life if the man you save is someone you despise? If you, the viewer, have ever felt the crushing weight of failure, not just financial, but the failure to be the person you know you should be, you understand this pit of despair. That self-condemnation is often heavier than any external judgment. I want to ask you, when everything you valued was stripped away, what was the hardest loss to bear? Was it the material comfort, the prestige, or the loss of belief in your own capabilities? Share your thoughts below, because the journey through loss is one we all must walk. For me, the hardest loss was the sudden, undeniable proof that I was fundamentally flawed, a brittle vessel masquerading as an iron fortress. I lay there, waiting for the shadows to lengthen and claim me, the heat radiating off the stones feeling like the final embrace of the grave. The ledger slipped from my fingers, finally released, lying open to the page that chronicled the loss of the vessel's Miriam's Hope and the Golden Promise Dash. The names mocked me. I had neither hope nor promise left. The end did not come as a swift, cooling darkness, but as a low, persistent humming. Distant sounds, amplified by the canyons, gradually resolved themselves into the distinct noise of a large gathering, hundreds, perhaps thousands, of people moving, talking, and gathering. It was strange. This area was far too remote, too dry, for a major festival or troop movement. Yet, the sound was undeniable, carrying with it a resonance of hope and excitement that seemed utterly foreign to my desolate location. A shepherd, leading a small, thirsty flock, eventually found me. He was a simple, sturdy man with eyes crinkled by years under the sun. He didn't recognize me, thankfully, simply seeing a derelict traveler. He offered me water from his goatskin, cool, life-saving liquid that was the sweetest thing I had ever tasted, and helped me sit up. He pointed vaguely to the northeast, towards a gentle slope that rose above the stream bed. "The teacher is near," he said, his voice reverent. "He has been speaking for hours. The crowds follow him. They say he performed a great thing yesterday, feeding everyone with almost nothing." My heart, which had been slowing to a dangerous crawl, started to pound again, not from fear of capture, but from the sudden, visceral recognition of the man they were talking about. The Rabbi Jesus. He had somehow crossed the sea and drawn the very crowds I sought to avoid, bringing the vibrant, distracting noise of life into my calculated zone of death. I watched the shepherd walk away, leaving me slightly revived but immensely reluctant. I wanted nothing to do with crowds, especially crowds drawn by promises of spiritual redemption. I needed to hide, but I couldn't move much farther. Crawling on my hands and knees, dragging my useless legs, I managed to reach a vantage point above the stream bed, sheltered by an overhanging rock. From there, I could see them, a sea of people spread out across the hillside, listening raptly to a single figure standing on a natural pulpit, bathed in the late afternoon light. Even from this distance, Jesus radiated an authority that was unlike the stern, judgmental pronouncements of the temple priests or the cold, hard power of the Roman officials. His voice, though not loud, carried clearly, speaking with a simple, profound clarity. I saw no theatrics, only connection. Then, something specific happened, not a miracle of scale, but a miracle of intimacy that utterly shattered my remaining cynicism. A small boy, perhaps 6 years old, had apparently wandered away from his parents and was crying, lost in the mass of adults. The crowd was pressing in on itself, and the child was terrified. Immediately, Jesus paused his teaching. He didn't just point to the boy. He stepped down from his slight elevation, walked through the throng, which parted almost instantly, deferentially, and knelt in the dirt beside the child. He did not speak a profound word of wisdom. He simply took the child's face gently in his hands, looked him in the eye, and spoke a soft, comforting phrase that I couldn't hear, but whose effect was immediate. The boy stopped crying and clung to the teacher's garment. Jesus then lifted the boy and, holding him securely on his hip, scanned the crowd until he found the frantic parents and reunited them. The entire exchange took less than 2 minutes. Yet in those 2 minutes, I saw a compassion that was utterly foreign to the world of commerce I knew. In my world, a lost child was an inconvenience, a distraction. To Jesus, it was the central priority. I saw the parents' overflowing relief, the boy's instantaneous trust, and the utter lack of irritation in the teacher's expression. It wasn't about the grand healing or the mass feeding. It was the unwavering focus on the one, small, vulnerable life. That simple act of kneeling, of valuing the lost child above the pressing needs of the thousands, struck me with the force of a physical blow. It didn't solve my debt problem, but it began to melt the ice around my heart. I was drawn out of the shadows not by faith, but by a desperate intellectual curiosity. I needed to understand the source of that peace I had witnessed. The sun was dipping low, and the crowds were beginning to disperse, taking their joy and excitement with them, leaving the hillside quiet except for the stragglers. I waited until the teacher was almost alone, surrounded only by a few close disciples, before painfully rising and stumbling towards them. The closer I got, the more terrifying the prospect became. What would I say? "Rabbi, I am Silas, a great failure, and I need a miracle of silver and wood to restore my ships?" That was the old Silas talking, demanding material compensation for spiritual ruin. But the new, broken Silas had no demands. He only had shame. When I finally reached the small circle, the disciples looked at me with varying degrees of skepticism and pity. I must have looked dreadful, sunburnt, skeletal, covered in dust, the evidence of my destitution plain for all to see. But Jesus, who had been speaking softly to a man named Peter, turned and looked directly at me. His gaze was not piercing or judgmental. It was simply knowing. It was the gaze of someone who had already read the entire ledger of my life. My successes, my failures, my arrogance, and my current despair, and accepted it all without condition. I dropped to my knees not out of reverence, but because my legs finally gave out again. The tears came then, hot and thick, tears of exhaustion and self-loathing. I didn't know how to start the conversation, so I didn't. I simply held out the one thing I still carried, the accursed, sweat-stained ledger. It was my confession, the document proving my worthlessness. "I have lost everything," I choked out, the words raw and painful. "I am ruined. I have failed everyone, especially myself. I owe men what I can never repay. They seek my life for the debts listed here." I shoved the ledger toward him, expecting him to glance at the numbers, perhaps shake his head sadly at the scale of my folly. Instead, Jesus did not even touch the book. He looked past the papyrus, past the calculations of loss, and focused entirely on me. "Silas, he said, his voice remarkably gentle, pronouncing my name as if it were a rare and valued thing. You worry about the debts of silver and timber. You obsess over the accounts owed to Caius and Eleazar. Tell me, if you were to somehow wipe clean every number in that book, would your heart be whole? Would you truly be free? His question was a spear thrust into the core of my self-deception. I froze. I realized that even if a miracle of gold materialized at that instant, I would still be the same hollow, proud, grasping man who had built his life on sand. The debt was not the disease. It was merely a symptom of a far deeper rot in my soul. I stammered, unable to form a coherent reply, only the realization